I'd like to pick up here where I left off in the last video and simply continue to elaborate this map to make it a bit more relevant, a bit more complete. The, though one of the first things you should note is that when I created this map and saved it, that there isn't a ID number for this map. And it's just because of the way the Insight Maker works. It's actually saved and there is a number for it. So if I go back to here and look on my insights, here is that insight map that I created. So if I now just click on this and open it, then it gives me the version with I don't know what that is, with the unique ID number. So this is map number 23,278. And I meant to delete this. So in this particular session, what I'd like to go ahead and do is, back to once you reopen this with the ID number, if you want to share this with someone else, all you have to do is send them this URL and they can access the map that you developed. They won't see all of the options for editing the map because they don't own it, but they could clone it to create a version of it that belonged to them. So as we develop the map, the way that we determine additional things that we should put on the map is we simply look at all of the elements and we ask, what does this influence, or what influences this that's relevant to what we're considering? And for this particular situation where I have a project that's the completion date is much later than the intended deadline for the project, and the first thought is we should work overtime. If you're going to work overtime for a couple of days or maybe a week, it's not a problem. Though if you work overtime, if the people on the project have to work overtime for an extended period of time, it's likely to create fatigue. So we'll create a copy of this and we'll call it fatigue. And we know that fatigue it takes time for fatigue to happen. So we'll just call this, we'll add a label here that says after some delay, work overtime creates fatigue. And the difficulty with fatigue is that it has a negative impact on productivity. So what we'll say is, as fatigue increases, it reduces productivity. And though productivity, if we increase productivity, it should reduce the expected completion date. So here we should say reduces, even though, and let me put a waypoint on here and move this so that it's up here a little bit. So the way that you think about it is you sort of ignore everything else and you think about this particular variable in relationship to what it's influencing, and you say, if I increase this, what impact is it likely to have on this variable? So if I increase or improve productivity, it's likely to reduce the expected completion date, which is a good thing. And if I decrease productivity, it's likely to decrease this. Now there are instances where increases and decreases don't work in the same fashion, and it has to do with certain types of variables. If you think about something like production and inventory, as I increase production, inventory increases. If I decrease production, inventory still increases, just not so fast. So you have to think about the character of the variable that's being influenced, because sometimes the variable influences it to change in the same or an opposite direction, and sometimes the variable actually adds to it. It depends, and which is why it's good to add notes to labels or variables so that someone else who receives the link or looks at or finds your model in Insight Maker and looks at it has something more than just a wiring diagram to look at, because wiring diagrams are typically not sufficient to convey all that you were thinking as you were developing this relationship map. And which is also why later on we'll talk about how you do storytelling in Insight Maker, because if you present a model to someone else in a manner where it tells a story, it has a tendency to connect far better than if you just give them the wiring diagram and say, here, what do you think? Usually they're overwhelming, and people just get turned off because the diagram is overwhelming. So in terms of some additional pieces that you might put in here, if we work overtime, it, I think, typically has a tendency to increase cost. So we'll go ahead and put this down here and say increases. And what else? Well, another alternative to working overtime, we said that if we work overtime for a long period of time, it's likely to create fatigue, have a negative impact on productivity, which will actually end up moving the expected completion date out rather than in. So maybe another alternative is to add additional resources. Though, all right, so if we add additional resources, the tendency is for additional resources to also increase cost. Sometimes the diagrams get a little busy and you have to figure out how to actually display things so that they don't run over each other. And this is just add. Though if we add resources, it should, oh, there's a variable I left out of here that should be here that I didn't realize when I was doing this, but if I delete this, if I work overtime, there's a variable here, I think, which I would call labor quantity. It's the amount of effort applied to the project, and if I work overtime, it should increase this. And increasing the labor quantity should reduce the expected completion time. And if I add, I just, what this actually points out is that seldom do you ever get these right the first time. It's sort of one of those, you work on it and you think about it and you work on it and you think about it and you realize that, well, this is what I thought yesterday, and now that I've thought about it, this makes more sense. So that you should expect your relationship maps to evolve as you work on them. If you ever get one right the first time, you should be frightened. I would be. So if I add resources, that would tend to increase the labor quantity. So I'll just say adds to. Right? Though the piece that isn't typically obvious here is that if I add resources, that has a tendency to initially reduce my productivity. If you add additional resources, somebody has to bring them up to speed. And the people that bring them up to speed are the people that were working on the project to begin with. And Frederick Brooks wrote a marvelous book in the 80s called The Mythical Man Month, where he essentially said adding additional resources to a late software project only makes it later. And then the reason is because the resources, which I can't spell, obviously, adding additional resources tends to have a negative impact on productivity for some period of time, so that while additional resources may be appropriate for a longer period of time, initially things get worse before they get better, which is often not taken into consideration. So this is just some thoughts about how you go ahead and continue to elaborate the model and add additional relevance to it based upon simply asking yourself the same two questions over and over again. What does this variable influence, and what influences it? And the deadline it's hanging out here in midair, but it isn't really. It's actually connected to some other set of relationships that just aren't considered appropriate for this particular relationship model because I'm not in a position to change the deadline. Though in certain instances, changing the actual deadline might be appropriate. You might learn things in the midst of the project to realize that the initial deadline was not appropriate. So it would be appropriate to change the deadline based upon learning. It's just, you have to think about those things that are relevant to the situation that you're considering and add them to the map. If you're not sure whether it's relevant or not, add it to the map. If you think about something and you determine that it's not relevant, I typically try to keep a list of those things that I determined were not relevant, because when someone later says, "Did you consider this?" Do I remember all the things that I considered and decided that they weren't relevant? If I have a list of those things that I considered not relevant, then it's easy to go ahead and explain to someone else, yes, I considered this, and this is why I figured that it wasn't relevant, and that's why it's not on the map. So I hope this gives you a better sense of how to develop a relationship map. In the segments to follow, I will go into what may be excruciating detail in terms of options that you can use to create relationships and make them more and more meaningful. So I'll see you in the next video. Bye.